It is now my pleasure to turn today's webcast over to Greg Mattis, Senior Counsel with SelectHealth. Mr. Mattis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Teresa, and I appreciate Zions Bank for sponsoring this webinar. The title of our conversation today is the Affordable Care Act, What Your Business Needs to Know, and more specifically, I want to make it more concrete. Really identified 6 things that you need to know about healthcare reform. And before we get into the content of those things and talk about those 6, I wanted to first of all find out a little bit about you, find out about what size employer you are. So you've got 6 options here, and we're going to push a poll out to you where you can give us your feedback. The question is, what size are you? And your options are A, nimble, B, small. Actually, it looks like these are numbers. 1, nimble, 2, small, 3, large, 4, extra large, 5, supersize, 6, too big to fail. So please feel free to respond. Get an idea of sort of what the constituency of our audience is today. Give it another 5 seconds. Looks like a lot of people are coming in. Okay, it looks like we've got a lot, and I'm going to try and publish those results. We've got a lot of nimble employers, so 1 to 15, so very small, and this act certainly is going to affect you, and it looks like the second largest category is small, 16 to 41. So the majority of people on the call are in that traditional small employer size under insurance law. That's helpful for me to know. The next thing I wanted to ask of each of you is, which choice best describes your feelings about January 1st, 2014? I'm ready, bring it on. I'm a work in progress. I've learned a lot, but I still have questions. I'm worried. I don't know what I don't know. I harbor dark, deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. Or why? Is something big going on in 2014? So let's give you a chance to answer which of those best describes you. Some of you probably want to do multiples. I certainly have a couple that apply to me. Go ahead and tell us which one of those best applies to you. Getting some clear leaders here. This is interesting. I'm going to push these results out in a second. 3 more seconds. Okay, so we're closing the poll, and interestingly, number 3, I'm worried, I don't know what I don't know. That describes so many of us, followed up by, I'm a work in progress, I've learned a lot, but I still have questions. Interestingly, only 3 of you confessed having dark, deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. If I had time to answer the poll, I would have maybe thought about answering that one myself. I know that really is the way it feels for many of us, and I'm not surprised by the bulk of people being worried about what they don't know and having learned some but having more questions. And hopefully we can clarify some of those things today. We mentioned feel free to ask electronic questions during the presentation. I'm not going to be able to have time to multitask and answer those during, but we'll try to answer some of them afterwards, and we'll answer questions afterwards that you can pose via audio as well. And if we don't get to your written questions during the presentation, we'll make sure that we do at some point, and we'll get back to you because we'll have a record of all those questions. So feel free to ask them. So I don't know how many of you remember this, but about a year ago, the movie came out, Unstoppable. I remember thinking at the time that it seemed like it was a pretty good analogy. It said the tagline on the trailers was 1 million tons, 100,000 lives, 100 minutes in theaters everywhere on November 12th. And I thought, you know what, that's really kind of describing the ACA train. It's got 1 million pages, 100,000 questions, and 10 answers in companies everywhere, January 1st, 2014. In a lot of ways, the ACA feels unstoppable, and that actually brings us to the first of these 6 things that we want to cover today. And that first point is The politics are going to continue, but the ACA is not going away. You'll recall that at first the big question on everyone's mind was, what are the Supremes going to say about this? What is their opinion about the constitutionality? And we found that out a year ago this last summer when the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the Affordable Care Act is constitutional. Judge Roberts was the swing vote. He was really in some ways a court of one, but he held, and I have the excerpt from the opinion on your screens, the court today holds that our Constitution protects us from federal regulation under the Commerce Clause, as long as we abstain from regulated activity, but from its creation, the Constitution has made no such promise with respect to taxes. And he dusted off the old gem from Benjamin Franklin about death and taxes. The point being that a lot of people thought that it would be held unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause, and Justice Roberts said, no, it is constitutional. Excuse me, it is not constitutional. It is constitutional as a tax, not as a exercise of commerce, which was a surprise to a lot of people. There was a lot of talk last summer about broccoli, and this is because this was in the opinion and it was in the media. So put another way, Congress does not have the power to make you buy broccoli under the Commerce Clause, but it does have the power to incentivize you by taxing your failure to buy broccoli. I found all the talk about broccoli last summer actually fascinating. It seems like we've got a national fascination with this particular vegetable. Justice Scalia said from the bench, everybody has to buy food sooner or later, so you define the market as food, therefore everybody's in the market, therefore you can make people buy broccoli. You'll recall another famous quote about broccoli. Our first President, Bush, said, I do not like broccoli. I haven't liked it since I was a little kid and my mother made me eat it. And I'm President of the United States, and I'm not going to eat any more broccoli. So we have a storied history of broccoli jurisprudence. The Supreme Court did not save us from the Affordable Care Act. The next idea was, hey, the election will. President Romney is going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and then we won't have to worry about implementing it. As you know, it's not what happened. The election did not save us from the Affordable Care Act. We have had many times when you've seen the headlines, the House of Representatives votes to appeal Obamacare. The House has voted, actually, last I checked, this was a couple of weeks ago, 41 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And that's very confusing to a lot of people. They see that in the media and they think the act's not going to happen because it's been repealed. It takes more than the House of Representatives. The Senate has to do it and the President has to do it. Unless you have a two-thirds majority, you have 60 votes. In the Senate, you can override the veto. But those 60 votes have not been present, and the Affordable Care Act is not going away. We have lately efforts to defund it and some well-publicized efforts that have been in the media. We saw that, spearheaded by our own Senator Lee in Utah, as well as an actual vote from the House again to defund the Affordable Care Act. And I got a lot of questions last week about, so the act is going away, right? And the answer to that is no. That legislation that passed in the House is not going to pass the Senate, and even if it did, it wouldn't be signed by the President. The fact of the matter is we have a deep divide in our country, and the divide is about exactly this. This is Judge Vinson from the very first district court that considered this case about 3 years ago. He said the case isn't about whether the act is wise or unwise, whether it will solve or exacerbate the myriad of problems in our healthcare system. In fact, not really about the healthcare system at all. It's about federalism, which is a code word for politics. It's about what you view the proper role of the government to be. And that's a political opinion, and we have deep divisions in this country about what the proper role of government should be. Abe Lincoln put it this way: the shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as his liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty. Plainly, the sheep and the wolf are not agreed upon a definition of liberty. And that, I think, captures it in a nutshell. In this country, we're not agreed upon a definition of liberty. We're not agreed upon a definition of the proper role of government in healthcare. And as long as that divide continues, those politics will continue. But don't mistake that for the actual act itself. It's here to stay for the foreseeable future and is not going away. Okay, the second point that you need to know about the Affordable Care Act is It's potentially very confusing. There's a whole host of changes that take place on January 1st, 2014. And I find it helpful to think about it in a simplified fashion, to think of 5 big changes that are going to happen in 2014. First of all, everyone qualifies for coverage. Secondly, everyone is required to have coverage. Third, some people get financial help. Fourth, coverage and costs are changing. And finally, there are new shopping choices, both in the products that are available to consumers, including employers, as well as the place where you can buy those products. I want to talk a little bit about each one of these, but I find this framework helpful for steering conversations about what the Affordable Care Act is really all about. And it's these 5 big changes that are pretty good, big picture categories. So first of all, everyone qualifies for coverage. This is the well-publicized fact that the system on January 1st, 2014 moves away from medical underwriting, where people get insurance based on their health status, to a world where it's guaranteed issue. Everybody gets in the insurance pool regardless of their health or their claims experience. Their coverage can't be denied or delayed. You can't even have a waiting period in an employer-sponsored plan of more than 90 days. I wanted to drill down on that for a second because there's been some confusion about that, particularly in Utah. The statute says that that requirement becomes effective on the first plan year beginning on or after January 1st. The Utah Insurance Department said at first, this is about 6 months ago, that it became effective on January 1st across the board. And so we had a duel between the state and federal governments. That's been recently clarified. The Insurance Department agrees that the effective date is for plan years beginning on or after January 1st. So for you groups that have a non-January 1st renewal, this maximum 90-day waiting period requirement will not become effective until your renewal date. Now, for those of you who have a January 1st renewal, the interesting thing about that is it reaches back into 2013 because on that date, on January 1st, you can't be imposing a waiting period of longer than 90 days. You can't start the clock over. You instantly become subject to the rule, and so it reaches back all the way into October 1st of 2013. The other thing is that some employers have talked about doing, first of the next month after 90 days. That would violate the Act. If you're going to do first of the next month, it needs to be first of the next month after 60 days, so it doesn't get longer than 90 days, which is the maximum period. In this new world, there's community rating. As we move away from health underwriting, the only factors that carriers can take into account are self versus family coverage, geography, age, and tobacco. They don't have to take all those factors into account. A lot of carriers are not imposing an extra surcharge based on tobacco, but that ability is there up to a 50% differential under the Affordable Care Act. And then there's going to be a risk adjustment process where, as we move away from health underwriting, through risk adjustment, the insurers that get that low-risk population, the ones that aren't very expensive, are going to end up transferring money to the insurers who attract the higher-risk population, who have, who are more expensive. And the idea here is to have insurers not worrying about avoiding risk like they have been, but to be focusing on managing health conditions and on getting and keeping people well. So that's the first big requirement. Everybody qualifies for coverage. The second one is everybody's required to have coverage. Well, mostly everyone. And there's exceptions to that requirement, including for those with religious objections, for those who are incarcerated, for American Indians, for people whose lowest health care option is more than 8% of their household income, for undocumented immigrants, and for those who have an income beneath the tax filing threshold, because the way that the individual mandate is enforced is on your individual income tax. And so if you don't file an individual income tax return, you're not subject to the penalty. The penalty starts relatively small. In 2014, it's only $95 per adult, with a maximum of only $285 per household, or up to 1% of household income. But those penalties increase over time, and in 2016, they're all the way up to, I think it's $695 per adult and $2,000 per household and 2.5% of household income. The third point is you have this mandate that everyone have coverage and everyone qualifies for coverage. For those people who need help, and maybe for some who don't, there are subsidies available, and those subsidies come in a couple of different categories. There's individual subsidies as well as the small employer tax credit, and we'll talk about both of those. On individual subsidies, there are two kinds. The first kind is the advanced premium tax credit. This is the subsidy that most people are talking about in the media and that you've probably heard about. This is a subsidy that's available at the point of purchase, and we'll talk about it. But to qualify for the subsidy, you can't have qualifying insurance through your workplace. You can't be eligible for a public plan like Medicare, Medicaid, or CHIP. And you have to have an annual income that's between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level. To give you an idea, that's very high, 400%. For a family of four, that goes all the way up at the 400% level to $94,000 annual household income. So it's actually going well beyond low-income families into middle-income families, very relatively generous subsidies. They work on a sliding scale. At that 400% of FPL, they're not going to be very generous. And they work as a percentage of your income. So at the lower levels, between 100 and 133% of the federal poverty level, you only have to pay 2% of your income as premium. And that goes all the way up to 9.5% of your income at the higher levels. Practical example of how that works. In this case, this person's at 150% of the federal poverty level. Means the maximum that they can pay is 4% of income. $56 for single coverage, $115 for coverage for a family of four. So they go in to shop with that amount of subsidy, which is the maximum amount they can pay is $56. The subsidy is actually available in the marketplace and linked to the second lowest cost silver plan. That's somewhat confusing, but that's what the statute says. And this gold, silver, and bronze, these metal levels have to do with cost sharing. Silver is a 70-30% split. So in a silver plan, the plan picks up 70% of the cost, and the consumer picks up 30% of the cost through deductibles, co-insurance, co-pays. In this scenario, let's say that the premium for that second lowest silver plan in the particular market is $300. Well, the maximum amount this person has to pay is $56. So they have a subsidy of $244 per month that's available from Uncle Sam at the point of purchase. They only have to pay $56 in the marketplace for coverage. The second kind of individual subsidy is a cost-sharing reduction. And the way cost-sharing reductions work is they, too, are also linked to your income as a percentage of FPL. So in this case, somebody who is anywhere between 250 and 400% of the federal poverty level, they have an actuarial value in that silver plan of 70%, like I mentioned. And by the way, these subsidies are only available in silver plans. The first subsidy, the advanced premium tax credits, you can use those subsidies, even though they're tied to the second lowest silver. You can use those to buy a gold plan, to buy a bronze plan. That doesn't matter. The second kind of subsidy, the cost-sharing reduction plan, is only available to those who enroll in a silver plan because it works like this. Usually that cost-share split is 70-30. But depending on your income, it will be increased in favor of the consumer. So at the top of that scale, you can see that if you're between 100 and 150% of the federal poverty level, your cost-sharing goes from 70% to 94%. You're only responsible for 6% of the cost of the plan. Your deductibles, your co-payments, your co-insurance are dramatically reduced. So these are not in the alternative. Consumers can get either one of these, either one or both of these things. They can have an advanced premium tax credit as well as a cost-sharing reduction available when they purchase coverage in the exchange. The second category is for employers, and this, of course, really, when you look at the sweet spot of the people who are on this call, this should be of particular interest to you. The small employer tax credit has been around for a few years, but it's been available at the 35% level. On January 1st, 2014, it goes up to 50% at the most attractive point. And this, too, is on a sliding scale, but here are the basics. You have to have fewer than 25 full-time employees. They have to have average annual wages of less than $50,000 per FTE. And you need to pay a uniform percentage of the cost of that insurance of at least 50%. If you qualify for all those requirements and you purchase the plan in the marketplace, then you can get up to a 50% tax credit, which is obviously very attractive. Now, that 50% is only available for the lowest paid workforces and with 10 FTEs and with wages at 25,000 average, and that's on a sliding scale between 10 and 25 FTEs and between 25,000 and 50,000 per year. And you may have looked at this before when it was at 35%. I encourage you to take a look at it again now that it's going up to 50%. We have on the SelectHealth website a small employer tax credit calculator that can help you do that. I encourage you to visit selecthealth.org and use that tool to see whether or not that might be attractive to you. And even though you've looked at it before, take a look at it again because it might easily be more attractive now with the high end being at 50%. Okay, the fourth point is coverage and costs are changing. You may have heard about essential health benefits. This is the floor. It's a bottom amount of benefits that has to be covered by all of the plans in the small and individual marketplaces. And it includes things that haven't been included in small employer coverage in the past. For example, like mental health parity, that used to be just a large employer mandate. 2014, small employers have to cover mental health and substance abuse. They have to also cover a defined list of preventive services, as well as maternity coverage. And there is a list of things that have to be covered in an essential health benefits plan. And that list varies from state to state and even from plan to plan because you can substitute with actuarial equivalents. So you go from that list as a starting point, but a carrier can then take out one item and cover something else as long as they get back to the same equivalence from an actuarial standpoint. There are no more annual and lifetime dollar limits. And deductible and out-of-pocket costs are now capped in 2014. So there are a lot of changes coming to coverage. What's going to happen with costs? Well, as you might imagine, with that expansion in coverage, the general trend is going to be upward pressure on premiums as well. What specifically will cause premiums to rise? Well, in addition to that expanded coverage, there are more high-risk individuals who are going to be in the market. Now, the people who used to be uninsured, covered by a high-risk pool, are now coming into the market, and they're expensive. And the market, because it's community rated, has to bear that risk, and so that will create upward pressure. What is going to cause premiums to fall? Well, that's a trick question. Premiums don't fall. They only have a lower rate of increase, kind of like the national debt, right? You'll read the media headlines about how we're reducing the national debt over the next 10 years by X hundred of billions of dollars, or $1 trillion. They don't actually mean we're reducing the national debt. They mean we're reducing the rate at which we're increasing the national debt by $1 trillion over the next decade. We never actually reduce the national debt. And you could say, well, that's the same thing with premiums. They're not going to fall. There'll be a lower rate of increase. In actuality, that's not true in this case. Costs are actually, in real dollars, going to fall for various categories of people. Most notably, those that qualify for these new federal subsidies through the marketplace. If you're that low end of that scale we looked at a few minutes ago, you have a very good chance of your premiums being substantially lower than they have been. And you have lower premiums if you used to be at the high end of the underwriting scale. If you used to pay relatively high premiums because of a health condition or because of your age, when we move towards community rating, those people will also experience a decrease in premiums. The fifth point, big picture about the Act is there are these new shopping choices. Medicaid under the Act was supposed to expand. After the Supreme Court decision, that's now permissive, which means the state's going to choose whether or not they want to expand. It's up to each state. Utah's leaning against it. Idaho has specifically said they're not going to expand for now. So that's probably not happening in those two states. It is happening in a lot of other states around the country, and the idea there was to expand coverage for low-income individuals. Another new shopping choice is the health insurance marketplace that I've been referring to. They used to be called exchanges. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And there's also new products, including catastrophic plans for the young invincibles who haven't previously thought they needed insurance. This is an enticement that goes along with the mandate to give them a product that makes sense for them and provides only catastrophic coverage at an affordable rate. The third thing you need to know is that 2014 begins October 1st. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but really, in many ways, in many significant ways, 2014 begins next Tuesday. Why is that? because that's when these marketplaces are open for business, or I should say are scheduled to be open for business, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. In Utah, we have a divided marketplace. The federal government is going to administer our individual marketplace, and our small employer marketplace, known as a shop under the Act, is actually going to be provided through our own existing Avenue H, which is the name for the small employer marketplace that's been up and running in Utah for 3 or 4 years now. It used to be called the Utah Health Insurance Exchange and got rebranded about a year ago to be named Avenue H. In Idaho, both the small and individual marketplaces are going to be supported by the federal government. It was originally elected by Idaho that they wanted to have state-based marketplaces, but the functionality was not quite ready yet, and so they're deferring to the federal government to help provide the engine for those two marketplaces. So they're called state-based but federally supported marketplaces. But in Idaho, there's not going to be small employer choice because the federal government is running that, and the federal government doesn't have the functionality in the small employer marketplace to allow employee choice in 2014. The employer picks the plan, and the employees sign up for it. In Utah, there will be employee choice in Avenue H. So who's in the marketplace? And in the individual marketplace, we'll hit that first in Utah. And this is, I've listed these more or less in alphabetical order, as you can see, give or take. And there were some surprises here. Some people were surprised by the entrance of Molina into the individual marketplace, and that's really about the fact that they're a significant player in Medicaid. And as individuals go back and forth between the Medicaid and individual marketplace, I'm sure they wanted to have a product for them so they didn't have to switch carriers. Also, if you note there on number 4, BridgeSpan is a Regents-affiliated entity. So that's really Regents' representation in the individual marketplace. In Avenue H, the list is quite a bit shorter. There's only 3 carriers that are participating in Avenue H in 2014 in Utah. I understand we've got some people on the call from Idaho today. Your Health Idaho is for both individual and small. We know who's in. And on the individual marketplace, these are the main carriers. There's actually about 6 or 7, but there's some who have really almost no presence in the marketplace. Those are the 4 main ones for individual. And on small, again, a shorter list of carriers that are participating in the small employer marketplace in Idaho in 2014. Some observations about the individual marketplace. You know, I get a lot of questions about, is it going to be open for business on October 1st? And I've got an observation about that. I think it will be open for business more or less, on schedule more or less. And I know from a lawyer you would expect nothing more definitive than that. I apologize for the hedge, but here's the reason why I'm hedging. I think back actually about something that has become sort of an iconic image. If you think back to the last Gulf War, there's this photo of President Bush standing on the deck of an aircraft carrier, and behind him was a banner that said "Mission Accomplished." Turns out, of course, the war wasn't over. It was far from over. And I think that we're going to have a scenario like that this next Tuesday. I think that the marketplaces will be declared open for business, that there will be a victory dance, the federal government will pump its fist in celebration, and there will be a media announcement, yes, we're open for business. But the reality will be something less than that. I think the reality will be that the functionality will be somewhat limited, probably with some significant limitations. And so if you actually open up the hood and look under the hood, it may be that a lot of the wiring is not yet connected. It may be that the gas tank is not connected to the engine just yet. Avenue H in Utah, by the way, to its credit, was experiencing similar technical difficulties and announced this last week that October is window shopping only. You're welcome to go on to Avenue H beginning October 1st, but they're not actually going to take enrollment. They're not actually going to process enrollment until November 4th, and I love the fact that they made that announcement. We are hoping, at least in the insurance industry, that the federal government has the candor, has the courage to do the same thing with the individual marketplace and the states where it's operating the small employer marketplace, which includes Idaho, same story, because there are going to be similar limitations. And what we fear is that they'll declare victory, the state of the marketplace is open, people will go in, they'll enroll for coverage, and then they'll wonder why they've never heard from SelectHealth. Why didn't I get my enrollment cards? Why haven't I received a welcome letter from you? That's poor customer service. Well, the reality is it will be because we literally won't know who they are, because the connectivity won't yet be established and they'll be enrolling into a black hole. That's a doomsday scenario. We hope that that's not what happens. But it's entirely likely that on October 1st there are significant system limitations that are going to take at least a month or so to iron out. I can tell you that right now, as we speak, that functionality is not up and running, and October 1st happens this next Tuesday. Another observation is that I don't think this first year is going to be representative for carriers or for members. There are people who are sitting on the sidelines and not going to be in the marketplace until they kind of see how it works. And we know that's happened with some carriers, and it's going to happen with some members as well until they sort of let somebody else be the guinea pig. So I don't think we can judge this experiment until it's been up and operating for a couple of years. Subsidies, I believe, are going to drive enrollment in these marketplaces. As we mentioned, they're very generous, and I think that people will follow those dollars into the marketplace. And finally, I think that you will continue to be rewarded if you ascribe to the philosophy, oh, excuse me, I skipped one. Let's go to 6 and then I'll hit 5. I think you'll continue to be rewarded if you expect surprises. We certainly haven't been disappointed with that expectation so far. There have been plenty of surprises, and I think that's going to continue as the law of unintended consequences continues to play a role in this rollout. The fifth point that I skipped over, and I apologize for that, is be careful in the marketplace. They're going to divide plans by metallic tiers, which we've discussed. At the low end, that bronze plan is a 60-40 actuarial split where the consumer picks up 40% of the cost of the coverage on a cost-sharing basis. And at the high end, the platinum is 90-10. And that's how, the marketplace is going to be organized by a metallic tier. But that isn't the whole story. So you can have an awesome-looking silver plan with a great price tag. It might have a very narrow network. It might not have anything better than the absolute minimum required essential health benefits. And so it's a new world out there, and in exchange land, in the marketplace, metals aren't the only story. Look at network, look at benefits as an employer, look at benefits, because they're definitely not going to all be created equal. Avenue H here in Utah is going to continue to have some things that the federal government is not for at least a year, maybe longer. In Avenue H in Utah, employees can continue to have that choice of carriers. It's a defined contribution model where the employer can pick a contribution amount, and then the employees go in and comparison shop and decide how they're going to spend those dollars. That's not available in the federal shops. So in Idaho, that's not going to be available in 2014. It is in Utah. Employers are going to have consolidated billing, which is not available in the federal shop. And then, Avenue H is going to continue to have education and outreach efforts, and brokers will continue to play a role in Avenue H. Participation rates are going to continue, and there will be flexibility on employer funding. I mentioned that breaking news. They're not actually accepting enrollment until November 4th. Subsidies and credits are only available in the marketplace. Either both the small employer tax credit as well as individual subsidies. Only place you can get them is in the marketplace. I think that will drive people into that market. This is my favorite slide of the whole deck, and you look at it and you think, why would that be? It's not very interesting. Only got one bullet on it. The thing I love about this slide is that it used to be 3 or 4 slides. Back when we started the regulatory timetable that was facing us, and it was over 6 months ago now, there were 3.5 slides worth of content. There has been an enormous effort to jump through a long series of hoops, first with the state government and then with the federal government, to make sure that we had qualified health plans. The last couple of bullets happened within the last few weeks. We have been certified as a qualified health plan. Other carriers have been through that same process. Between then and now, there was an inordinate amount of brain damage trying to comply with the very complex federal requirements that govern what these plans have to look like beginning in 2014. It just is endlessly heartwarming to me that we have a single timetable element left, and that's this beginning of open enrollment, we hope, next week on October 1st. There are defined open enrollment periods. Issuers have to maintain year-round open enrollment for employers to purchase coverage. You can get in the small employer market year-round, but the final rules impose a new open enrollment period in the small group market where issuers can enforce participation and contribution requirements throughout the year, but during that annual open enrollment period between November 15th and December 15th, issuers are not allowed to enforce participation and contribution requirements. So that obviously is the time when small employers are going to want to get into the market, is that annual opportunity that happens late in the fall. Those are the first 3 points. We're halfway. We're probably going to go even faster on points 4, 5, and 6. Most of the heavy lifting is out of the way. What's the fourth point? Well, there is no uniform definition of large versus small employer, and this is a problem. And the definitions actually vary from provision to provision, and as a result, there are people, and there are probably people on this call, entirely likely that there are people on this call who are both a small employer and a large employer at the same time. The reason for that is, again, there's this great variation of how the provisions apply. The market reform provisions, for example. The ACA says that they apply to groups that are 100 employees and up. But they also say that states can have their own definition for the first 2 years. So states can wait to implement the 100 life threshold. And Utah and Idaho have both done that. And for Utah and Idaho, the definition is at 50 instead of at 100. But it's 50 eligibles in Utah, and I'll show you Idaho in a minute. And that's different in shared responsibility, which is the large employer mandate. And I noticed we didn't have a lot of large employers on here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. But for that large employer mandate, it's 50 full-time equivalents, which means if you have a lot of part-time employees, you might be a small employer for purposes of community rating, for purposes of essential health benefits. But you're a large employer for purposes of the mandate. You have to provide coverage or be fined. The definition for automatic enrollment requirement, where we don't have regs yet, so it's not actually effective until we get regulations, is 200. The definition for W-2 reporting is you have to have more than 250. And for the small employer tax credit, as we've already discussed, it's 25. So it's literally all over the map. What you have to remember here is you've got to think about it provision by provision. In Utah, for those market reforms, it's 50 eligible. For Idaho, it's also 50 eligible, but not inside the marketplace, because the federal government isn't capable of administering 50 eligible. Inside the marketplace in Idaho, it's 50 FTEs. If you find this confusing, you would be right. It is. And that's why I'm cautioning you to pay particular attention to which provision is at play. You may have heard about early renewal. We'll talk about it briefly. It doesn't work for employers to try to delay shared responsibility, because under those regs you can't do it. So be careful. If you're subject to the large employer mandate, doing early renewal is not going to get you out of it. A smooth sea never made a skillful sailor. One of the bright spots, and I'm a silver lining kind of guy, to this whole experience is that we have been making some incredibly skilled sailors. The environment we've been in looks an awful lot like where that ship is on that photo, and we've had the opportunity to develop a whole skill set that we never had before, and you may be having those same sorts of opportunities as you navigate these uncharted waters. The fifth point is, don't believe everything you hear. You probably already knew that. That's pretty good advice in life. It's particularly on point when it comes to the Affordable Care Act. I'll give you an example that happened this last month. This last month, the New York Times, of all publications, very reliable, esteemed publication, had this headline: the limit on consumer costs is delayed in the health care law. It said it's a big setback for the Obama administration. It's been delayed until 2015. That would be nifty if it were true. That headline is absolutely not true. The rest of the article, when you drill down into the details, was substantively accurate, but it is not accurate to suggest that the limit on cost share was delayed. What happened was there was a narrow exception, and it didn't happen last month either. It happened clear last February. The federal government explained that they're providing a one-year exception to that out-of-pocket cap for plans that carve out their benefits to a separate service provider. The best example of that is a pharmacy benefit manager, a PBM. So let's say you have Express Scripts as your PBM. The federal government recognized, rightly so, that it's difficult for the health plan to coordinate with an outside separate service provider like a pharmacy benefit manager, and that because of the difficulty in having those two systems talk to each other, they are delaying the requirement that they be integrated, that those two maximums be aggregated and coordinated together electronically. That's been delayed a year. The underlying requirement has not been delayed. The underlying medical plan still has to comply with that out-of-pocket cap, and the separate carve-out piece, in this case the PBM, still has to comply with the cap. And I've shown you there what those numbers are for 2014. It's 6350 single, 12.7 family. Those apply across the market, and they didn't go away. They haven't been delayed. There's just this narrow exception I just described. So here's another question for you, and this will segue us into the next thing. In the Getting to Know You department again, have you considered dropping coverage to allow employees to get individual subsidies? So we talked about you're not eligible for subsidies if you are eligible for qualifying employer coverage. So have you thought about it? Thought about doing it? No, we haven't thought about it. Yeah, briefly, but we decided against it. Or actually, we've seriously thought about it, but decided against it. Or yes, thought about it, and we're doing it. So I've just pushed the poll out to you. Give us your response. Have you been tempted? Are you attracted to this option? Did you seriously think about it? And what was the end state of your deliberations? A lot of results coming in. This is very interesting. Okay, I'm going to close in about 3 seconds. Looks like we got a lot of people. You got 3 more seconds to respond. And there's the results. Very interesting. Majority, no. But look at the percentage of people. 21% who thought about it briefly, but decided against it. And collective, 30% who seriously thought about it or are actually dropping their coverage, almost 17%, pushing 20, who are actually dropping coverage because of those subsidies. That's interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about that, and let's talk about one of the things that's been out there in the marketplace in conjunction with this idea. The question is can you drop your small employer coverage and contribute to your employees' individual coverage through an HRA? I get that a question a lot. There's some people out there who are proposing that employers do that. You certainly, when you drop your plan, don't have to do this, but this has been out there in the marketplace. And the answer to that is no, you can't. And let's talk about why not. The background is, the proposal is, look, employer, there's a lot of cost involved with sponsoring a plan. Drop the coverage and then use some of that money to fund your employees' purchase of individual coverage through the marketplace. It's a win-win because they get the subsidy and you can still make that contribution to them on a tax-free basis through the HRA. The problem with that proposal is all 3 main regulatory agencies have now explicitly stated that that practice violates the Affordable Care Act. And the rationale is that it violates the bar in the Act against annual or lifetime dollar limits on essential health benefits. So if you, let's say you pegged a contribution at $2,000, that's a limitation on coverage on the essential health benefits because you're only covering $2,000 worth. Now, first of all, this is the actual FAQ from last January where they said it, and most recently on September 13th, just a couple of weeks ago now, all 3 agencies issued Technical Release 2013-2, which specifically confirms that under the ACA, that standalone, non-integrated HRA, if it's not part of a larger health plan, can't be used to fund pre-tax payment of individual coverage. They also expanded that to health FSAs and premium contribution arrangements or reimbursement arrangements. And the ruling was actually very broad. You might have some criticisms of that. You might disagree with that. There are those who, I think, validly point out that's a very strange application of Section 2711. I don't think that was the intent of that section. There are those who have attempted to distinguish the IRS guidance and saying, it's not really consistent with what the IRS said in prior rulings. There are those who are still marketing these arrangements even after this guidance from the federal government. I would simply caution you as follows. To me, it seems that what matters is that today, this year, as recently as 2 weeks ago, you got 3 federal agencies who said that they think it violates the ACA. I would pay attention to those opinions. It also poses other issues under the Act as well. Excuse me, not under the Act, under ERISA and COBRA, because many people don't follow the formalities they're supposed to for those plans. Nothing can stop you from reaching your goals. False goalies can, Dwight tells us, and there are more than a few keepers standing guard over this whole process. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and then we'll have some time for questions, is there's a new notice requirement for employers. You have to provide a notice telling people about the availability of these marketplaces and the consequences of purchasing a qualified health plan in the marketplace. That was supposed to be effective in March, got delayed along with a lot of other things under the Act because we didn't have any regulations in March. We actually did get them in May. And what we now know is that you have to have on that notice information about the fact that there's this new marketplace. How do you contact it? What kind of services are provided by the marketplace? How does eligibility for advanced premium tax credits work? And warning, to the point we just covered, that the employee is not going to receive an employer contribution towards individual marketplace coverage because they've said it doesn't work that way. Who does this apply to? It applies to you if you have more than $500,000 in annual volume. So it's the same standard as the Fair Labor Standards Act. If you're subject to FELSA, you are subject to this notice requirement. What about the timing? It's supposed to be out by October 1st. So the good news there is we've got time. We've got plenty of time. It's not till Tuesday. For new employees, it's within 14 days of the date of their hire, and both of those have to be in writing in a manner calculated to be understood by the average employee. If you want the best news of this section, sorry, I'm premature. It's not that there's model notices, because there are. There's one both for employers with health plans and one for those without. And by the way, the notice applies to everybody. You have to send it even if you don't have a health plan. But the good news is the DOL actually, about a week and a half, 10 days ago or so, let everyone know that there are no penalties under the Act for failure to send the notice. There was a big question about that. A lot of us thought that there would be penalties under either the general penalty provisions of the ACA or the general penalty provisions of the FLSA, and the DOL confirmed that they will not be issuing penalties for those who don't send the notice. Still recommend that you do. I think it's helpful for your employees. It will save you from getting a lot of the questions. It'll be good for them to know about their options in the new world. So, in conclusion, coming back to where we started, this thing does feel unstoppable. And there's a thing about disaster movies that I think is at least comforting, and that is, in every one of these disaster films, including Unstoppable, it all works out in the end. There are some white-knuckle moments. There are some times when the train's up on, on 2 wheels, as it were. When you wonder whether or not you're going to get through it, when you're going to survive in one piece. But by the end of the movie, and this happens this is like so trite, it's incredible. At the end of every disaster movie, there's people standing around by the emergency vehicles with blankets, and they're sipping coffee or cocoa. And that's at the end of all these movies, because in the end, it all works out. Well, at least for the people who survive. And on that unhappy note, I will conclude and be happy to take your questions and in either form. Those who have been submitting questions through the Q&A, we can answer some of those, but also feel free to submit audio questions at this time as well.
If you would like to ask an audio question at this time, please press star and then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. And to withdraw your questions, please press the pound key. And at this time, we would like to continue to take any web questions that you might have for us today. To continue to submit those questions via the web, click the Q&A button on the lower left-hand corner of your screen, type in your question in the open area, and then click Send to submit.
Okay, so I've got some questions here. While you're doing the audio piece, if you're so inclined, I've got some electronic questions I'm happy to answer. There's a question about will there be separate maternity plans or will they be included? That maternity benefit is required to be in the coverage. It's not a separate plan. Part of essential health benefits now, and it's got to be in the plan. Do federal subsidies start 10/1/2013 or do they start January 1st, 2014? Great question. I didn't mean to create confusion by saying that January 1st begins October 1st. What happens on October, or the 2014, excuse me, begins October 1st? What happens on October 1st is enrollment in the exchanges. So you can actually shop for coverage and enroll in coverage, but that coverage is not effective in the marketplaces until January 1st, 2014, and that's when the subsidy kicks in as well. It doesn't actually kick in until the coverage is in place, which is January 1st. There's a question about what about those on Medicare? For the most part, this act does not affect people on Medicare. There are some provisions of the Affordable Care Act that impact Medicare, but they really don't affect most people. There's a pilot project called the Medicare Shared Savings Program, which is about trying to experiment in the Medicare program with some of these concepts of accountable care. But that, for the most part, is not going to affect most people on Medicare. Another question, which is, we have around 40 full-time equivalents, part-time employees, and seasonal employees. How do we calculate the number to see if we, oh, that's unfortunate, that it doesn't show the whole question. Maybe if I click on the question, oh, okay. To see if we, still doesn't show me. I wish I could tell what that question is. We'll get the whole question and we'll provide that answer offline. Let's see, what other questions are there that are coming in? Well, first of all, let me ask, do we have any live questions?
Not at this time.
Okay. So let's go through a few more. It looks like we have another 5 minutes. Let's see some more of these electronic questions. In the individual marketplace, what constitutes income? That's a great question. I get a lot of questions about that. How do I know what the income is? How do I know how that compares to the federal poverty level? Here's what it is. It's MAGI. If you look on your individual income tax, there's a line, I forget the line, where you list your modified adjusted gross income. And it's that line that they're looking at in the marketplace, your modified adjusted gross income. Great question. Now, that's for purposes of seeing where you are for federal poverty. For purposes of looking at, your income with respect to the percentage, for example, from the employer perspective, let's look at that for a moment. When you're offering, the test is that you actually are not eligible for a subsidy if the employer offers affordable coverage and coverage that is minimum value. That affordability is 9.5% of household income, but there is a safe harbor for employers where employers just have to look at W-2 income. That can be confusing for people because the statute says household, but the regulations say that you can look at W-2 income because you're not going to know what people's household income is. And so when you're trying to figure out whether or not your coverage is affordable for people for purposes of the large employer penalty, you can look at the W-2. Okay, where can I get a sample notice for employees? Also, great question. The DOL has released a model. If you go to the DOL's website or if you just Google exchange notice or model exchange notice, it'll be one of the first 5 hits. They have 2 sample notices plus some sample language that you need to put in your COBRA election notices because now people have to be told that under COBRA, as part of the COBRA election notice, they have to be told about these new marketplace options. And so go to the DOL website or just Google exchange notice or model exchange notice, and it'll pop up pretty quickly. I've got a question. What about employers with less than 25 employees? I'm not sure the context in which that was asked. The context in which I mentioned it is that that's the small employer tax credit. If you've got under 25 employees on a sliding scale, you're eligible for the tax credit. If you want to clarify that with a larger question, feel free to do that, and I'm happy to answer it. We have fewer than 5 employees. Are we required to provide insurance for our employees? I'm glad you mentioned that. We haven't been talking about the large employer mandate very much because this is most of you are small employers. The large employer mandate and penalty only applies to you if you have 50 or more full-time equivalents. So that means that it's not just your full-time employees. You could have a whole lot of part-timers. To give you an idea, if you have 50 people who work half-time, that's 25 FTEs, full-time equivalents. That's how that math works. So, you could have quite a few part-time employees and not hit that 50 FTE threshold, but the large employer mandate, the requirement that you have to provide coverage to your people, only applies to you if you have 50 FTEs or more. Okay, what else? Looks like we're almost out of time. Let me take one last question. We've got a lot of them to choose from. And by the way, as I've mentioned, we're going to respond to all these questions. We have a list of everybody who's asked questions, and we'll do our level best, even though we're going to go off the air here, to respond to all the questions you've asked to the best of our ability. Let me take one last question. How do you access the marketplace to sign up? Go online, talk to an insurance agent, something else? Great question. There's actually a lot of ways to access the marketplace. It is an online existence. So, in Utah, for example, the small employer marketplace, Avenue H, is avenueh.org, I think it is, or it might be .com. I think it's .com, avenueh.com. And then that's the actual, portal. Healthcare.gov for the federally facilitated marketplace is the place where you start. But you can also access it via your brokers, and you can also access it via your insurance company. But, knock on wood, it's going to require that functionality to be up and running. And I don't think it's going to be up and running on October 1st. But say by November 1st, we hope to have functionality where you can start at SelectHealth website. You start the process. We then send you off to the marketplace to do the part that has to be done there, and then you'll come back and finish the process at the SelectHealth website. That functionality has been difficult to put in place. It's probably going to be a little bit delayed like some of the other pieces of the Act. Hopefully that's up and running well before January 1st, and we're shooting for as soon as possible. I really appreciate all those questions. We'll try to answer the ones afterwards offline as best we can. Really appreciate all of the participation.
Thank you again for joining us today. This concludes today's web conference. You may now disconnect.